I want to just pick up on this quotation from Richard Dawkins, where he says, I can't remember which book it's in, Devil's Chaplain, I think. He says something like, science is the poetry of reality, which is a lovely quotation. I really like it. And I'm just wondering to what extent we can kind of take that literally, really. Because clearly what he's not saying is that science has the same status as what we normally think of as poetry. I don't think he's claiming that. Nor is he saying that reality is a poetic artifact in any kind of conventional sense, although I think there is an argument to be made for that. So what is he saying? I think the way I'm looking at that is that science operates in very particular ways, and those ways can be reducible to poetic figurations, to poetic tropes, ways of treating the world, treating language, treating symbolization, treating communication in ways which are identifiably poetic, but which nevertheless have a close relationship with lived experience, with the concrete, material, physical world that we walk around in. In terms of what kind of poetry it is, I mean, the three kind of poetic parts of speech I would be interested in thinking about with that would be ones that Raymond Gibbs talks about actually in Poetics of Mind, which are metaphor, metonymy, and irony. He talks about synecdoche as well, but I can't really think about that right now. So I think the task would be to consider to what extent metaphor, metonymy, and irony figure within science, and by that I don't just mean the kind of discussion around science, but I mean at the heart of the scientific project itself. And then latterly, perhaps, and I certainly won't be able to do that today, latterly is to think through the implications of that, really, or think to what extent those processes differ from other kinds of poetic processes. In terms of metaphor, science does seem to be replete with metaphor. Roger Jones writes about this really well in a book called Physics as Metaphor. It's all over Rafael Nunez's writing. He talks mostly about mathematics, but it refers to other kinds of sciences as well. And George Lakoff and Rafael Nunez's book about mathematics, where mathematics comes from or came from, again is in that area really, about the fact that science seems to be underpinned by a whole series of metaphors, which isn't, as I say, the same thing as saying that science is incorrect or science is poetic, only that metaphor is such a fundamental part of our cognitive process that it's part of everything we do, and science is no exception to that. Okay, so the second thing, metonymy. Okay. Metonymy is when a part is substituted for a whole. I think I'm right in saying that. So people talk about cattle as heads of cattle. So you kind of ignore the body and the hooves and the horns and the tail and all that kind of stuff, and just focus on the head. And you talk about heads of cattle. Or you might talk about, you might refer to business people or to bureaucrats or administrators as suits. A particular type of business person or a particular type of administrator as a suit. So you're ignoring all of the kind of idiosyncratic differences between these people and focusing on a particular, what might be seen as a representative aspect of these people. So what you're doing, I think, when you do that in conventional kind of vernacular linguistic terms, is you're selecting a part of a group which identifies that group. So all cattle have heads, and you're also selecting a part which allows you to distinguish that group from other very closely related or apparently similar entities which, whilst they may appear similar, have significant differences. So not all administrators, not all business people, not all bureaucrats are referred to as suits. Even though they might wear a suit, you're identifying a particular characteristic of which subdivides an otherwise larger and perhaps inchoate group and gives them a characteristic. So you're using it metonymically. Head, suit is a metonym. And I think science does that all the time. I think a lot of the scientific enterprise is about finding characteristics of general, complex, overlapping, in some ways chaotic experiences, physical experiences of the world, physical properties of the world at large, finding elements which are stable within that, which represent larger quantities of those things. So you can talk about one proton, and that one proton allows you to talk about all protons. You can talk about one apple falling from a tree, and that allows you to talk about all objects falling everywhere. So there's something about representative examples which allows you to generalize metonymically across a group, and also to subdivide and distinguish those entities from others which perhaps have superficial similarities. So I think there's something distinctly metonymic happening within, the scientific enterprise. And this last one is to do with irony. I think irony is an easily misunderstood term. It's usually kind of thought of as meaning either kind of quaintly weird, as in that song Isn't It Ironic, which doesn't contain any irony at all as far as I can tell, or it means kind of speaking with a raised eyebrow. But really irony is to do with distance and distinction. It's talking at the heart of irony is about that. It's about there being a distance between what you say and what you mean, for example, or in dramatic irony that you find in the theatre, it's about a distance between what the on-stage character knows and what the audience knows. There are two meanings present, two viewing positions present on the action. The viewing position that the character in the play has, and the viewing position that the character in the audience has, the audience member has, who can see the disaster that's about to fall, or can see the inherent comedy in a situation that's not available to the person who's embedded within the action on the stage. So it's about that kind of separation. And I think even in things like the raised eyebrow, which we think of as a kind of, or speaking in an ironic tone of voice, again it betokens a separation. There's a gap between what you say and the way you say it, or you're signalling that there's a gap between what you say and what you mean. So it's always about separation, irony. It's always about distance and detachment. And again, within science again is all about distance and detachment. It's about constructing a viewing position on an experimental viewing position, a position that's external to the perimeter of the experiment, an experimental viewing position in which you are no longer completely embedded within the action. You can carry out processes, you can gather data. You are no longer completely enmeshed within that. You have a viewing position which is detached, and ideally detached to such an extent that you're effectively absent. You're not participating in it in any way. I know there's some complications with that in terms of experimental effects and all that kind of quantum entanglement stuff, but if you can detach that from that, for now, the ideal position of science is one of detachment. And again, that's a very ironic position. Okay, so I think that's probably all I've got to say on that, really. So just to return to this thing, let me just clarify what I think I'm saying here. To the extent that science is the poetry of reality, that poetry mobilizes, science mobilizes poetic tropes, poetic forms. And the ones I've been trying to flesh out here are metaphor, metonymy, and irony. And what I'll try and pick up in a later video is why it does that, and what the distinction between scientific poetry and any other kind of poetry